This is an NBC News special report. Here's Tom Yamas.
And good evening. We are coming on the air with a lot of breaking news right now on a historic day here in Alaska. Any moment now, President Trump is set to speak at a news conference after he met face-to-face with Russian President Vladimir Putin about the future of the war in Ukraine. The Kremlin has said that their negotiations have wrapped up, and they said Vladimir Putin will appear with President Trump at the news conference we are expecting at any moment there on the left hand of your screen. Both world leaders shaking hands during a red carpet welcome earlier at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. Putin was seen smiling while hitching a ride with President Trump. That moment followed by a high-stakes meeting between the U.S. and Russian delegations. It comes as President Trump tries to reach a ceasefire and a peace deal that could end the 3 years of fighting and all of that killing in Ukraine. I want to get straight to our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander, who was there at that news conference. Peter, the schedule changed pretty dramatically. What do we know at this hour?
Yeah. Tom, that's exactly right. We are inside the room, just about 100 to 200 feet away from where the delegations had been meeting for most of the last 2 to 2.5 hours. Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin not holding a one-on-one, absent the time they spent together in the presidential limousine, but they're joined by, on the U.S. side, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, as well as the Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff, and alongside Vladimir Putin, some of his top advisors as well. It was our expectation that there would be an expanded meeting where the delegations would bring in additional advisors over lunch to gather. It's not clear whether that took place, but what is clear is that we do expect to hear from both President Trump and Vladimir Putin very shortly here on Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. This was a stunning turn of events. This was not how we anticipated. The expectation was this could go on for quite some time. The president has detailed what his expectation was coming into the day when he was on Air Force One shortly after departing Washington, D.C. He said he was hoping to come away with a ceasefire, and that in his words, he would not be happy if that didn't happen today. The president has also said in recent days, Tom, that he would be willing to leave, in effect. First, he said he would know after the first couple of minutes of his meeting with Vladimir Putin whether Putin was open to a deal, a ceasefire or a wider peace deal. And he said that if things went south, in effect, that they went sideways, that he was very willing to walk away, that there wouldn't be a joint news conference, that he would take some questions and immediately head home. So at least by his own standard, by that metric, it appears that some progress was made. In exactly what form, we wait to see. Certainly a lot of questions for Vladimir Putin as we reach now 3.5 years into this awful war. And there have been so many eyes focused on this in anticipation with the relentless bombardment of Ukraine continuing by the Russians. Vladimir Putin, among the questions today will be Donald Trump has had a complicated relationship with Putin dating back to Helsinki in 2018, where the two held a joint news conference. And at that time, Donald Trump, in effect, sided with Vladimir Putin as it related to Russian interference in the 2016 election over the assessment of the U.S. intelligence community. But more recently, the president has been much more critical of Putin, saying, in effect, that when they speak, Putin is quite nice, but it turns out, as he watches, the president watches more headlines of more attacks killing soldiers and civilians alike, that Putin's words are meaningless. So among the questions we'll be looking to ask today, why Donald Trump can trust Vladimir Putin, that he would not continue with this invasion if an agreement is reached here. But the bottom line is we do anticipate much earlier than initially expected to hear from both President Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin just moments from now. Tom.
Peter, take our viewers into what you think may be happening right now. And, of course, a lot of this is fluid. There's a lot we don't know at this hour. We're going to learn in a few moments as soon as those two world leaders take to that stage. But you've covered a lot of these bilateral meetings. We saw the schedule today. What stands out to me is that this was going to be the last event for the day before Vladimir Putin jumps back on his jet and heads to Moscow and President Trump heads back to Washington, D.C. Having covered a lot of these meetings, what can we read from these tea leaves? Again, the Russians earlier today said this meeting could last 5 to 7 hours. We're about less than 3 on our clock right now. What can we sort of glean from that?
You know, Tom, it's a good question. I think that's what all of us are waiting to see the answer to. I will say that the images we've seen already today were not only historic, they were also striking, and certainly in the eyes of some of the presidents, President Putin and President Trump's critics, I think they may have been startling to see Vladimir Putin in the back of the presidential limousine where he was chuckling, laughing, smiling. The two of them, though there wasn't a one-on-one, in effect had a one-on-one privately with what we believe were no interpreters in the vehicle at that time. So what were they speaking about during that short visit? But recognize, I think, as we anticipate this dramatic moment here, that Donald Trump, throughout dating back to his time as a businessman successfully in New York, as a television producer, really is the producer of this presidency. And we watched it play out in real time a bit earlier today as the two men, at almost at the exact time, descended the staircases from their aircraft. They walked down that red carpet, shaking hands, as Russian media noted, for about 15 seconds, excuse me, in total. Donald Trump patting Putin's hand as they shook, the two sharing smiles and brief exchanges before they walked up on top of that platform where they were framed by American fighter jets, a U.S. warplane surrounded by other fighter jets flying overhead, ultimately before they entered the beast, the presidential limousine. So a lot of this choreography appears to be that Donald Trump has become so known for. The one thing we don't know is what happened in those private moments that the two shared, not only in the beast, but behind closed doors here as well.
We thank you for that, Peter. Stand by for us. If you're just joining our coverage right now, we are waiting at any moment for both President Trump and Vladimir Putin to take the stage there at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson and start their news conference and possibly take questions. We are live all over the world tonight for this historic moment. I want to go live to Ukraine right now as we await the two leaders. Richard Engel is there. And Richard, you heard Peter's reporting. We saw all those images today, including that image of Vladimir Putin in the back of the beast, smiling and waving. And already those images and the warm welcome he got here in Alaska is being broadcast throughout Ukraine.
Oh, 100%. The state television here and all of the news channels in this country are covering this wall to wall. And they've been highlighting the fact that President Trump greeted Vladimir Putin warmly, that they shook hands, all the things that you and Peter were just talking about. And they also, it wasn't lost on anyone here, they also noticed how different that was to when Vladimir Putin visited the White House earlier this year and got questioned about why he didn't wear a suit, and that visit ended early, and many felt that Zelensky was bullied by President Trump and his inner circle. But aside from being somewhat curious about the different receptions and maybe even a little bit offended, Ukrainians' concerns about what is happening right now in Alaska go far deeper than the different kinds of greetings that President Trump has given to Vladimir Putin or President Zelensky. They're much more concerned in this country about the long-term consequences, much more concerned about what's going to be said in the next few minutes. Because these two leaders are coming out to the podium, does suggest that they have reached some sort of agreement, that they have something to announce. This country's future could depend on what they announce in the next few minutes. And that is much more concerning to Ukrainians than who got a better handshake or who got a better ride in the back of the limo. Russia currently occupies 20% of Ukrainian territory. And Ukrainians are concerned that in a peace deal, Russia could get to keep some or all of that territory permanently, or at least in a medium term, redrawing Ukraine's borders and transferring population.
All right, Richard, stand by for us. I know you're going to want to hear what's in this news conference as well. I also want to bring in Keir Simmons, who has been covering Russia for years for us, one of the last Western journalists to interview Vladimir Putin. Before we get right to Keir, I do want to say it's 6:30 p.m. on the East Coast and it's 2:30 p.m. here in Alaska, where at any moment President Trump and Russian leader Vladimir Putin are set to hold a joint news conference after a nearly 3-hour meeting with the goal of paving the way to a potential ceasefire in Ukraine. Again, at any moment, we're expecting both world leaders to walk out there and potentially take questions about what was learned, what was discussed, and hopefully if there's any progress towards peace in Ukraine. I do want to go to Keir Simmons. Keir, I know you've been listening to all the reporting. You've seen the messages out of the Kremlin. This meeting ending earlier than the Russians initially had stated it would go. Some parts of the schedule are no longer on the schedule. This was supposed to be the last event that was supposed to take place in about an hour. It's taking place now. What, if anything, does this tell us, having studied and covered the Russians for so long?
Well, I think President Trump and President Putin clearly have agreed something, or at least have agreed that it is safe, if you like, for the two of them to stand together. Those images you're looking at, to stand together in front of the world's media and take questions. How many questions will they take? How long will it last? All of those things we wait to see. I will say we have been here before, Tom. In Helsinki, we watched President Trump and President Putin hold a news conference. We know that President Trump likes the spectacle of it, likes the to and fro of it, and often can seem to be making policy in real time as he takes questions from journalists. Will he do that again here? In Helsinki, he was criticized hugely by many for giving too much to President Putin. Will this be different? Certainly, the bonhomie between the two leaders at the beginning of this, two hours ago, suggests that they got along well, and suggests that what you're going to see in the coming minutes are two leaders, ostensibly adversaries, who like each other and think that they can do some kind of a deal with each other. Why would they be walking out together this way unless that was the case? And we are hearing, Tom, reports from Russia that there are members of the Russian delegation sitting in the front row at that news conference, waiting to hear from President Putin themselves. A counterpoint to that, I would say, is that the meeting that we just have been waiting to finish was a meeting between Russian and U.S. diplomats. The economic advisors, the trade advisors weren't in the room. Secretary of State Rubio, for example, Foreign Minister Lavrov were there. Both Foreign Minister Lavrov and another of President Putin's officials speak fluent English, so that may have helped the conversation move at a pace. That being said, we do know President Putin often can be quite verbose, can have a lot to say. So what have they managed to do in 2 hours? I mean, all of these questions, we're just going to have to wait to see what the two presidents have to say when they walk out. It does look like at any moment.
All right, Keir Simmons, again, if you're just joining our special coverage here, we are waiting at any moment for President Trump and Vladimir Putin to take the stage there at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. You can see the backdrop and that banner, Pursuing Peace. The goal here for President Trump, he laid it out today. He would like a ceasefire agreement to come out of this meeting. On top of that, he would also like a second meeting, possibly a trilateral meeting, including the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky. I want to bring in the moderator of Meet the Press, Kristen Welker. Kristen, throughout the week, the White House had sort of downplayed expectations. They had lowered the bar, calling this a listening exercise, saying basically they just wanted to set the table for a future meeting. But today, President Trump set some goalposts, saying he does want a ceasefire, saying he does want a second meeting. In a short time, we're going to find out if that's a reality.
Tom, you're absolutely right. And that goalpost, I can tell you, in talking to European and Ukrainian officials throughout the course of this week, has been set by them, saying that basically a victory for President Trump would require him to walk away with an unconditional ceasefire. That word unconditional, hugely significant, Tom. They say if there are strings attached, that would be a victory for President Putin. So in talking to my sources right now, the reaction, one of waiting, watching to see what these two leaders have to say. Is this announcement one of process, or is there a real agreement that has been reached? Will there be a second meeting? And of course, the big question looming over all of this, does President Trump acknowledge that it is President Putin who is the aggressor in this case? That is what Democratic sources say they would like to hear from this president. This is, of course, a conflict that has divided the Republican Party. Some 51% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the war in Ukraine. Remember, he promised to end this in 24 hours of being elected. He has acknowledged it's proven more difficult than even he anticipated. So this is one of the biggest tests of his second term, Tom.
Kristen, stand by for us. We are getting some new reporting. This coming from the Kremlin. The Kremlin announcing this in Russia, that the news conference of the president of Russia and the U.S. will begin shortly. I want to go back to Peter Alexander. We see him there in the screen in front of the two podiums there. Peter, my question to you, I know you have trouble hearing because it's loud there. Do we know if the American press will be allowed to ask questions at this news conference?
Tom, it's a good question. We don't have an answer to that one yet. In fact, this came together very quickly. We did anticipate a news conference. It wasn't clear that both presidents would be here, though that was the initial expectation. Now the Kremlin has announced that Vladimir Putin will be here alongside Donald Trump. I was just speaking to some of the top White House advisors if they could give us any timing on this, any more specifics. They basically said, just wait. A Russian advisor to the president moments ago telling reporters, when asked what happened behind closed doors, he said, you'll have to wait to hear for yourself. So there is certainly a lot of anticipation about the way that this is going to play out right now. One in particular occurred there, whether they were able to come to some agreement on a ceasefire, whether the topic of, in the words of the president, divvying up Ukraine did come up, even though European allies and Ukraine itself have urged President Trump not to discuss that very topic without Ukraine in the room. So, in effect, we are right now in what Donald Trump, in TV terms, would describe as a cliffhanger. We wait to see exactly what happened here, specifically as it relates to those meetings. And certainly, as we've been listening to a lot of the Russian reporters here, including those from state television, they view this perhaps in much wider terms, beyond just the topics of a ceasefire, a potential peace deal as it related to Ukraine. They view this more broadly as an opportunity to restore a strained relationship between the United States and Russia, between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin themselves. So we will anticipate with you what happens, and we'll certainly have a lot of questions we want to ask both presidents. Whether we get that opportunity remains to be seen.
Peter, before you go, because we can see from the wide pool shot where you're standing right now, you seem to be kind of close to the front row, at least from where we're looking. Can you see which members of the Trump administration or cabinet members are already there, and or the Russians, or have they not arrived just yet?
Yeah, there are members of both delegations here. They're seated in the first rows on each side. Some members of the Russian delegation and of the American delegation. Notably, none of those individuals who were inside the early meeting that took place today, lasting more than 2.5 hours, are present for the U.S. That's the Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, Marco Rubio, the National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. They are not here as well. The expanded bilateral meeting, what was supposed to take place over lunch, was to include some of the top advisors economically for the president. The Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, Howard Lutnick is the Commerce Secretary. They were among those who were expected to be in attendance. But to this point, we don't know whether there was in some form an abbreviated expanded bilateral, or if they're just coming from what was a 3-on-3 meeting with their interpreters before arriving here. Tom, to pull back the curtain a little bit, this has been a remarkable day. In more than 13 years of covering the White House, I have not seen security like that, which we have witnessed here today as the American and Russian reporters were welcomed onto Joint Base Elmendorf Richardson. They each went through separate, in effect, vetting where they were swept to check for any equipment that wasn't allowed to be brought in, any weapons or anything of that kind. And one of the Secret Service officers heading up that process said to me that this was a much more meticulous process than you normally see. So meticulous that as we waited on buses to enter, there were literally Secret Service agents who were opening up each of the pre-prepared lunch boxes, breakfast boxes that were being brought in for those individuals who would be inside here, just to check them so that nothing was snuck onto the property here before today's meeting take place. If we look around this room, I would tell you there's probably a couple hundred individuals here, certainly a full contingent of reporters who cover the White House, the president, on a daily basis. There are dozens of Russian reporters as well, but there are also reporters from all across the world, all of whom obviously would be impacted by the potential of any agreement of any kind as it relates to this 3.5-year relentless war after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Tom?
And I do want to ask you about the reporters in the room, Peter, because explain to our viewers here, are most of the people that are in that room reporters? And how, in a news conference like this, a bilateral news conference, will people get to ask questions if it's opened up to questions, right? Because any reporter on any part of this globe would want to be in there right now asking those two men questions.
Yeah, it's a good question. We don't know the answer to that. I can tell you that every reporter that I'm seated around certainly has questions prepared. I'm sure there'll be a cacophony of voices as they all try to get heard by the president here, trying to get his attention. President Trump, when he holds news conferences regularly, does it a bit differently than past presidents, where he just sort of picks and chooses and calls on individuals as he likes. Whether or not there are some predetermined individuals who will be asking questions on either side, we don't know that right now. Traditionally, there are some opening statements, and I think that's where we will all be listening very closely to get a better understanding of what, if anything, was agreed to, what came of this private conversation, what it means to Ukraine. If the president has already had any conversation, any outreach to the Ukrainian president about the conversation here. He has said that his desire was, and he said it would be easiest if they just extended this meeting into some meetings in the days ahead that could also take place here in Alaska with President Zelensky in attendance. Is there any chance that that would take place right now? So there's just so many topics and so many questions, not the least of which relates to the killing, the deaths that have taken place across Ukraine over the course of this 40-plus months. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, certainly tens of thousands in Ukraine alone, where, as our colleague Richard Engel witnessed yesterday, there was another burial of multiple individuals drafted into the war. And the question is really, will Vladimir Putin stop his assault on Ukraine right now and accept Ukraine as an independent, sovereign neighbor next door?
Yeah, we hope to hear what they have to say. And again, at any moment, we're expecting both leaders to come out. Garrett Haake joins us now. Garrett, we were talking earlier that for the president to come out here, announce this news conference, to have that banner pursuing peace like we see it here, the entire world watching, they've notified everyone that this is going to happen at any moment. Yep. People are hoping, especially in Ukraine, that there is some progress. To come out here and not have any type of development, you can't imagine they would set all this up and have nothing to show for it, even though the schedule has changed.
Yeah, look, I mean, we talk about these summits as typically highly choreographed affairs. This has clearly become improv at this point. The lunch that we expected to happen between the broader delegations has gone away. There were elements to this that we had been told would not occur, that have occurred. This press conference happening much earlier than we've expected. So I don't want to lean too heavily on precedent here, but despite the best efforts of the White House to lower expectations about this meeting today, they got ratcheted back up by the president's comments on Air Force One, suggesting he'd be very upset if there wasn't a ceasefire to announce today, and by the stagecraft of this event. This is not some small meeting to set up a larger meeting, Tom. This is very clearly something that has been amped up by the president. The fact that Vladimir Putin is still here, that there are two podiums, that they're coming out, does suggest there's some positive development. I want to key in on something that Peter said, because I think this could be the delay that we're in right now. The president said earlier in this week that Zelensky would be among the first people he would tell if there was news out of this. That could very well be what's responsible for this delay right now.
Yeah, the president could be calling the leader of Ukraine, who is right now fighting a wartime president, to let him know of any developments. I do want to bring in the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, who has a tremendous amount of experience in bilateral meetings, in meeting foreign dignitaries, including Vladimir Putin. Ambassador McFaul, what do you make of what we've seen so far? We were told possibly the meeting could be up to 7 hours long. It was less than 3 hours. We're awaiting this news conference. I know it's all speculation at this point, but what do you think's happening behind closed doors?
Well, I'm just speculating, but I have been in these meetings with Vladimir Putin and President Obama. Sometimes the small group meeting goes longer. So the one that they just had goes so long that the larger meeting with the full delegation gets squeezed and maybe in this case canceled altogether. So that could be happening. I know the people in that delegation. I see the Russian delegation right now. I see Kirill Dmitriev's head. He is sitting right in the front row. And that suggests to me that the press conference is going to happen before lunch or there's no lunch, because he was supposed to be one of the delegates in the wider meeting. But whether that means a bad outcome or a good outcome, I just think we're just going to have to wait and see what the two presidents say. The fact that President Putin will be at the meeting suggests that there should be some positive news.
Ambassador McFaul, I'm going to tell you, it looks like we have Steve Witkoff, special envoy, who's done a lot of the negotiations with Vladimir Putin. He actually had the meeting that was the meeting before this one that essentially set the table so this could happen here in Alaska on U.S. soil. It looks like other members of the cabinet are going to be making their way inside right now. Ambassador McFaul, what is a victory for the United States, but maybe more importantly, for Ukraine to come out of this meeting?
Well, I'm glad you phrased it that way, because summits are supposed to be about what's good for us, the American people, not what's good for Putin or Trump individually. And I think the way we should measure success are our American security interests advanced as a result of this meeting. And in my view, we have a security interest in preventing Putin from dominating and annexing territory in Ukraine. So that's what I'm going to be focused on. Have the president advance that ball, because he put a lot of work into this meeting. I mean, literally a red carpet for an imperial dictator who has, not since Hitler or Stalin have we had a leader to launch a war in Europe of this magnitude, with this level of annexation, with this level of killing. So we better get something out of it.
You know, earlier in the week, European allies, along with Ukraine's president, said that President Trump had told them on a conference call that there'd be serious consequences if there wasn't a ceasefire. Today on Air Force One, President Trump was asked what he meant by that. He said economic consequences. We know that for Putin, he hasn't gotten as much ground. He hasn't gained as much ground in Ukraine this summer. We also know that President Trump has put the pressure on India, 50% tariffs because they buy Russian oil. Russia is struggling financially. Oil funds that war machine in Russia. What could the United States offer to Russia right now? Because there's not a lot of trade that happens between both countries because of the sanctions put in place by President Biden when Ukraine was invaded. But what can the U.S. offer Russia right now, you think?
Well, first, I'd say President Trump has threatened sanctions, and he's been tough rhetorically, but he actually hasn't implemented tough sanctions. Even the Indian sanctions, he hasn't implemented yet. And I think President Putin just keeps calling his bluff. If he wanted to get tough, if he wanted to signal that he was going to be more coercive, which in my opinion he should have done before the summit, not after, there are three things he could do. One, he could seize Russian assets, billions of dollars of Russian central bank assets that are sitting in America. He could do that overnight. Two, he could sanction all of the ships of what they call the shadow fleet that ships that oil out of Russia. Right now, we haven't done that. And three, he could sanction all of the Russian banks that provide the services to allow those exports to happen. He could literally do that on Monday if he wanted to show Putin that he was serious.
And you think from the delegation that the Russians brought here, you know, investment advisors, finance ministers, you think what Russia wanted to do here in Alaska was talk business, where President Trump wanted to talk a lot about Ukraine?
Well, most certainly that's what the delegation suggests. I know every single member of that delegation, by the way. I even know the translator. These people have been at this job for a long time. And without question, when you have the head of the Russian investment fund at the meeting, you're there to talk about business deals. Notably, the negotiator on the Russian side with the Ukrainians, his name is Medinsky, the person that's in charge of trying to negotiate an end to the war with the Ukrainians, they've met from time to time in Turkey, was not part of the delegation. And that suggests that Putin wanted this to be about U.S.-Russian relations, with Ukraine just being a part of it. It looks like, if they're not having that bigger meeting, that it was just about Ukraine. And I think that that's proper. I don't think there's any sense in talking about investment deals and trade until this war ends.
Ambassador McFaul, stand by for us. I know we're going to want to talk to you right after this news conference wraps. Kristen Welker, the moderator of Meet the Press, joins us now. Kristen, a lot on the table for President Trump. He promised to stop this war. His first day in office, we are more than 200 days in. That timeline has definitely been stretched. He says that he didn't mean that seriously, but, you know, he did say that on the campaign trail. We also know that his polling is in the 40s when it comes to his handling of the war in Ukraine. That's what Americans have been saying in two separate polls. And then we also know from reporting he hopes to win a Nobel Peace Prize at some point. And he may very well if he can establish peace in Ukraine. A major moment for the president along the lines that the most important thing here is to end the war in Ukraine.
Well, Tom, absolutely. And President Trump hasn't shied away from talking about that Nobel Peace Prize. As we all know, one of his biggest rivals, former President Barack Obama, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009. Tom, notably, another rival of his, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, made headlines by saying, look, if President Trump can end this war and give Ukraine back all of its territory, she would personally nominate him for a Nobel Peace Prize. Now, of course, that's all but impossible because territory is really what is at stake here, Tom. But it does underscore the backdrop, the political backdrop to all of this. As you say, his polling underwater, a slim margin. 51% of Americans say they disapprove of his handling of the war in Ukraine. So there's an immense amount of pressure for him to get this resolved. The Republican Party leading the charge, saying that the United States should no longer have to fund the war in Ukraine, send weapons to Ukraine. So that is part of the pressure that he is getting as well. And among the questions, he was in the room there, Tom, with a former KGB official trying to hammer out the terms of what, as he said, he hopes would be a ceasefire agreement. And so one of the concerns with his European counterparts was that President Putin would try to change the subject, would try to shift to his agenda, getting sanctions lifted, for example, trying to get a new nuclear arms deal with the United States. Was President Trump, were his counterparts in the room able to fend off and hold off President Putin's attempts to change the subject, Tom? That's the question.
We're seeing the president's cabinet come in now. We just saw Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Before that, we saw Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov come in and sit down right in the front row. We understand we are less than 2 minutes away from this news conference starting. Again, we were told and given signs about 30, 40 minutes ago it was going to start earlier, but this looks to be the real deal. It looks like the two leaders of Russia and of the United States will be walking out shortly. We also anticipate possibly they will take questions from the scores of journalists that are filling those chairs right now at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. Our reporter, Peter Alexander, is there. The Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio, along with Steve Witkoff as well. The envoy who sort of set the table for this meeting has been traveling really around the world to both Israel and trying to establish peace there, but also Russia, somewhat freelancing in the role. It kind of goes wherever the president wants to send him. And the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, his role transforming, spending a lot of time now at the White House as the National Security Advisor. These were the two men that were part of the U.S. bilateral meeting, the initial meeting that was supposed to take place, that we believe did take place. We saw sort of the pool spray, if you will. That's when they give us the first images of those people seen together. It is unclear what meetings happened after that. We believe it stands to reason that the lunch was scrapped on the schedule because of the timing of all this. It was kind of fast. I mean, it was less than 3 hours. The Russians had talked about possibly 5 to 7 hours. That being said, President Trump can come out here and say they had a wonderful lunch, they had several meetings, and they've made some agreements. But that's the big question. What have they agreed on? What did they come to terms on? And what does it mean for the people of Ukraine who have lost tens of thousands, who are still fighting so bravely, and who have sent their men of all ages to fight against the Russians, whereas the Russians themselves have taken about 20% of Ukraine and have called on North Korea and even their own prisoners to fight this war, even asking North Korea for ammo and weapons as well, as the U.S. has sort of had a back and forth with Ukraine over those weapons as well. No doubt Ukraine could not fight this war without the help of the United States. Kristen, if I still have you here, the relationship between President Trump and Vladimir Zelensky has evolved over the years. It looks like this is about to start. We see President Trump and Vladimir Putin. Let's listen in.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, our negotiations have been held in a constructive atmosphere of mutual respect. We have very thorough negotiations that were quite useful. I would like to thank once again my American counterpart for the proposal to travel out here to Alaska. It only makes sense that we've met here because our countries, though separated by the oceans, are close neighbors. So when we've met, when I came out of the plane and I've said, "Good afternoon, dear neighbor. Very good to see you. in good health and to see you alive. I think that is very neighborly. And I think that's some kind words that we can say to each other. We're separated by the Strait of Bering, though there are 2 islands only between the Russian island and the U.S. island. They're only 4 kilometers apart. We're close neighbors, and it's a fact. It's also important that Alaska has to do with our common heritage, common history between Russia and the U.S., and many positive events have to do with that territory. Still, there is tremendous cultural heritage back from the Russian America. For example, Orthodox churches and a lot of more than 700 geographical names of Russian origin. During the Second World War, it was here in Alaska that was the origin of the legendary air bridge for the supply of military aircraft and other equipment under the Lend-Lease program. It was a dangerous and treacherous route over the vast emptiness of ice. However, the pilots of both countries did everything to bring closer the victory. They risked their lives and they gave it all for the common victory. I was just in the city of Magadan in Russia, and there is a memorial there dedicated to the Russian and the U.S. pilots. And there are 2 flags, the U.S. flag and the Russian flag. And I know that here as well there is such a memorial. There is a military burial place several kilometers away from here. The Soviet pilots are buried there who died during that dangerous mission. We're thankful to the citizens and the government of the U.S. for carefully taking care of their memory. I think that's very worthy and noble. We'll always remember other historical examples when our countries defeated common enemies together in the spirit of battle camaraderie and allyship that supported each other and facilitated each other. I'm sure that this heritage will help us rebuild and foster mutually beneficial and equal ties at this new stage, even during the hardest conditions. It is known that there have been no summits between Russia and the U.S. for 4 years, and that's a long time. This time was very hard for bilateral relations, and let's be frank, they have fallen to the lowest point since the Cold War. I think that's not benefiting our countries and the world as a whole. It is apparent that sooner or later we had to amend the situation to move on from the confrontation to dialogue. And in this case, a personal meeting between the heads of state has been long overdue. Naturally, under the condition of serious and painstaking work, and this work has been done in general. Me and President Trump have very good direct contact. We've spoken multiple times. We spoke frankly on the phone. And Special Envoy of the President, Mr. Witkoff, traveled out to Russia several times. Our advisors and heads of foreign ministries kept in touch all the time. And you know fully well that one of the central issues was the situation around Ukraine. We see the strive of the administration and President Trump personally to help facilitate the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. And his strive to get to the crux of the matter, to understand this history, is precious. As I've said, the situation in Ukraine has to do with fundamental threats to our security. Moreover, we've always considered the Ukrainian nation, and I've said it multiple times, a brotherly nation, however strange it may sound in these conditions. We have the same roots, and everything that's happening is a tragedy for us and terrible wound. Therefore, the country is sincerely interested in putting an end to it. At the same time, we're convinced that in order to make the settlement lasting and long-term, we need to eliminate all the primary roots, the primary causes of that conflict. And we've said it multiple times, to consider all legitimate concerns of Russia and to reinstate a just balance of security in Europe and in the world on the whole. And I agree with President Trump, as he has said today, that naturally the security of Ukraine should be ensured as well. Naturally, we are prepared to work on that. I would like to hope that the agreement that we've reached together will help us bring closer that goal and will pave the path towards peace in Ukraine. We expect that Kiev and European capitals will perceive that constructively and that they won't throw a wrench in the works. They will not make any attempts to use some backroom dealings to conduct provocations to torpedo the nascent progress. Incidentally, when the new administration came to power, bilateral trade started to grow. It's still very symbolic. Still, we have a growth of 20%. As I've said, we have a lot of dimensions for joint work. It is clear that the U.S. and Russian investment and business cooperation has tremendous potential. Russia and the U.S. can offer each other so much in trade, digital, high-tech, and in space exploration. We see that Arctic cooperation is also very possible, and our international context, for example, between the Far East of Russia and the West Coast of the U.S. Overall, it's very important for our countries to turn the page, to go back to cooperation. It is symbolic that not far away from here, at the border between Russia and the U.S., there was a so-called international dateline. I think you can step over, literally, from yesterday into tomorrow. And I hope that we'll succeed in that, in political sphere. I would like to thank President Trump for our joint work, for the well-wishing and trustworthy tone of our conversation. It's important that both sides are result-oriented, and we see that the President of the U.S. has a very clear idea of what he would like to achieve. He sincerely cares about prosperity of his nation. Still, he understands that Russia has its own national interests. I expect that today's agreements will be the starting point, not only for the solution of the Ukrainian issue, but also will help us bring back business-like and pragmatic relations between Russia and the U.S. And in the end, I would like to add one more thing. I'd like to remind you that in 2022, during the last contact with the previous administration, I tried to convince my previous American colleague that the situation should not be brought to the point of no return when it would come to hostilities. And I said it quite directly back then that it's a big mistake. Today, when President Trump saying that if he was the president back then, there will be no war. And I'm quite sure that it would indeed be so. I can confirm that. I think that overall, me and President Trump have built a very good business-like and trustworthy contact. And I have every reason to believe that moving down this path, we can come, and the sooner the better, to the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. That was very profound, and I will say that I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting. It's ultimately up to them. They're going to have to agree with what Marco and Steve and some of the great people from the Trump administration who've come here, Scott and John Radcliffe. Thank you very much. But we have some of our really great leaders. They've been doing a phenomenal job. We also have some tremendous Russian business representatives here, and I think, you know, everybody wants to deal with us. We've become the hottest country anywhere in the world in a very short period of time, and we look forward to that. We look forward to dealing. We're going to try and get this over with. We really made some great progress today. I've always had a fantastic relationship with President Putin, with Vladimir. We had many tough meetings, good meetings. We were interfered with by the Russia hoax. That made it a little bit tougher to deal with, but he understood it. I think he's probably seen things like that during the course of his career. He's seen it all. But we had to put up with the Russia hoax. He knew it was a hoax, and I knew it was a hoax. But what was done was very criminal. But it made it harder for us to deal as a country in terms of the business and all of the things that we'd like to have dealt with. But we'll have a good chance when this is over. So just to put it very quickly, I'm going to start making a few phone calls and tell them what happened. But we had an extremely productive meeting, and many points were agreed to. There are just a very few that are left. Some are not that significant. One is probably the most significant, but we have a very good chance of getting there. We didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there. I would like to thank President Putin and his entire team, whose faces, who I know in many cases, other than that, whose faces I get to see all the time in the newspapers. You're almost as famous as the boss, but especially this one right over here. But we had some good meetings over the years, right? Good, productive meetings over the years, and we hope to have that in the future. But let's do the most productive one right now. We're going to stop really 5, 6, 7,000, thousands of people a week from being killed, and President Putin wants to see that as much as I do. So, again, Mr. President, I'd like to thank you very much, and we'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know. I'll get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening. Thank you very much, Vladimir. And thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So we have just been watching this news conference between President Trump and Vladimir Putin, and it is strikingly unclear what, if anything, was accomplished here. The president saying there is no deal until there is a deal, saying they have disagreed on some major points, but they've agreed on other points, that he's going to call NATO now. He's going to call President Zelensky. But this is quite incredible. Under the banner of pursuing peace here in Alaska on U.S. soil, Vladimir Putin's first trip to the U.S. in nearly a decade, it is unclear what they've accomplished. It is unclear what they've agreed on. And more importantly, it is unclear what this means for the people of Ukraine that are currently fighting a war against Russia that has invaded their territory. Peter Alexander was in that room there. Peter, you know, they were dropping sort of some nuggets here and there, but it's really unclear what they've agreed upon. Putin spoke a lot about a cooperation with the U.S., possibly in trade, in space, in high tech. I mean, a lot of platitudes were discussed, nothing concrete. What is your takeaway from what we just heard there?
Hey, Will, can you hear me?
Well, first of all, this is one of the very few times, Tom, I think we can say that the President of the United States had few words. How many times have we seen him where he took questions for hours and hours today, not taking a single question from reporters in the room, leaving unanswered a series of questions like, is there any ceasefire that was agreed to? It appears clear that there was not, at least from him saying there's no deal until there is a deal. He said there has been significant, as he described it, progress that's been made. A couple things are striking here. You'll remember the president earlier today, as he was departing Washington aboard Air Force One, said he was not going to be happy if there was no ceasefire reached. He would be willing to walk away from this without a news conference and fly back home. Obviously, he stuck around, but it doesn't appear that he came away with what he was hoping to come away with. What is still up in the air is what this means for Ukraine. I was struck by what we heard from Vladimir Putin, who in effect said that they had a series of conversations, and among those things that need to be addressed are the origins of this war, in effect blaming Ukraine for this war. I think most would agree, all should agree, that this was a war started by Russia, but it's unclear if Donald Trump supports the idea of an independent, sovereign Ukraine next door to Russia, why he would trust Vladimir Putin to stop the killing of soldiers and civilians alike. There are so many questions that remain unanswered. It's not just the future of Ukraine that remains up in the air, but ultimately its impact throughout that region. We're going to be working our sources right now. We are told that the reporters who were traveling aboard Air Force One have already been rushed out of the room gathering. That would indicate that they are going to be heading home very soon, that there are no extended conversations to take place later. But honestly, Tom, we've really never seen anything like this from a president who produced much of today's events right now and left with sort of leaving us again with a cliffhanger in effect.
It was interesting. Putin was trying to draw a distinction between the country of Ukraine, which he said is a brotherly nation, even though it's one that he invaded, and Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, where Vladimir Zelensky obviously lives, saying that Kyiv may throw a wrench in these plans. But again, both Putin and Trump talked about some type of plan, some type of deal, yet they offered quite literally zero details. And the president himself, though, at one point saying that thousands of lives will be saved if this deal is accomplished. But again, we have no idea what's going to happen. It sounds like he's going to go to NATO and go into I guess, the Ukrainian president and maybe talk about the terms of the deal and come back. But it's unclear. I do want to bring in now moderator of Meet the Press, Kristen Welker. Kristen, you've interviewed President Trump several times. You've covered these bilateral meetings just like Peter. You've been in the room. Look, if we start to read what's happened so far, a lot of the meeting was scrapped. It was shorter than we thought it was going to be. There's a news conference. No questions are taken. And now both leaders are on their way back to, Putin's back to Russia, President Trump back to D.C. What can we read from all this?
This is an extraordinary turn of events, Tom. Peter laid it out well. The fact that this feels rushed, the fact that we just heard from both leaders, and yet it's very cloudy in terms of what exactly was discussed, what was accomplished. They offered few, if any, specifics, Tom, and they took no questions. This is a president who relishes taking questions. The Russian president relishes taking questions when he holds his annual news conference that can last for hours on end. So the fact that this was so clipped, the fact that you heard from a somewhat muted President Trump underscores that he is not walking away from the ceasefire with a ceasefire agreement that he was hoping for. Remember, those were the terms that he laid out at the beginning of this day. That was how he was defining victory: an immediate ceasefire, an unconditional ceasefire. We did not hear the term ceasefire uttered. We didn't hear any end to the fighting talked about. And that really was the goal to this meeting, and to get a second meeting. Will there be another meeting with President Zelensky? I'm starting to get some reaction, Tom. A European source telling me this was a big nothing burger. A Republican ally of President Trump saying it's a very good start, but not providing any details. And a Democratic source saying it's really unclear what exactly happened here. So I think the broad reaction, watching and waiting to see if more details start to emerge, if anything was actually accomplished. And again, that critical question, Tom, will there in fact be another meeting? It seems far off based on the tone. Another meeting that would involve Zelensky, but we'll have to see.
Not only that, Christian, I mean, we have to know Putin somewhat made a joke about the second meeting happening in Moscow. So to me, that telegraphs a little bit about the seriousness, or maybe lack thereof, of a second meeting, and that they're not quite there yet. I understand you're hearing from your Republican sources as well about this being a good start. It's sort of hard to understand that because we don't understand it's the start of. People in the world, Ukraine obviously hoping this was the first step towards a path of peace. But again, it very may will be, but we don't know that quite yet because we don't understand what he's going to tell NATO and or the Ukrainian president. I do want to go to Richard Engel, who's live tonight for us in Ukraine. Richard, you've been listening to all of this. I'm sure Ukraine, it is very late over there in Ukraine. In the morning, they will wake up to these headlines. But I got to think people in Ukraine are going to be waking up wondering what just happened and what was accomplished.
While this may be unsatisfying, Tom, this was actually very good news for many in Ukraine. Ukrainians have been expressing deep concern that Putin or Trump would come out today and announce a deal, and announce that a ceasefire deal had been reached, or announce that a full agreement had been reached without the Ukrainians in the room. Instead, we saw President Trump acting very cautiously. It didn't look that way initially. I was quite surprised that it was Vladimir Putin who took this podium first, who spoke at length in Russian about history, and he talked about an agreement that had been reached, and he spoke quite clearly that there was a deal, and he was worried that the Europeans or the government in Kyiv, the Ukrainian government, which he attacked, would try and upset the deal, suggesting that a deal was in place and that the Ukrainians weren't going to like it. Then we saw President Trump said, no, we're not done. We're going to speak to NATO. We're going to speak to the Ukrainians first. And until it's done, it's not done. And implied that there's going to be more meetings, and implied that they're working on a deal that could save thousands of lives, i.e. a ceasefire deal. That is exactly the approach that the Europeans, that is exactly the approach that President Zelensky had been pushing for. They were telling President Trump just a couple of days ago on this video conference, go slow, don't trust Putin, don't sign any any big deals on the spot. Wait until we're involved. So while it may be cryptic and unsatisfying, it could have been much worse from Ukraine's perspective had they come out and made an announcement and the Ukrainians were caught surprised on the back foot and then having to digest a deal that they weren't part of.
It's a great observation, Richard. Stand by for us. I want to bring in Keir Simmons, who has covered Russia for so many years for us. Keir, you know a lot of those players in the room. You've interviewed Vladimir Putin one-on-one. Talk to me about what you thought about what Putin had said in his remarks. And there was that moment where President Trump was sort of having some fun with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and trying to give the press conference a moment of levity there with no deal announced. But there may be a deal that we just don't know about that the president is presenting to NATO and the Ukrainian president before he announces to the world. How did you interpret Vladimir Putin's comments?
Yeah, I mean, President Trump was almost trolling Sergei Lavrov, wasn't he? The arch-troller-in-chief of Russia. He's so good at it himself. I had to sit there and have President Trump turn the tables on him, in a sense. I thought President Putin's face was interesting after he made his statement. It wasn't the smiles and the laughs that you saw in the beast, in the presidential vehicle on the way to the conversation. I think it's interesting that President Putin had his trade negotiator sitting there in the front row, had flown all that way. And one point to make here, Tom, is, this is the heart of August. This is right in the middle of Russian vacation time. President Putin has pulled all of these Russian officials across the world to do this. And some of the meetings, it appears, haven't happened, and the lunch hasn't happened. To put it another way, this is not Helsinki, which is the famous news conference that President Trump and President Putin last held, where President Putin was hugely criticized for seeming to give President Trump was hugely criticized for seeming to give President Putin all of the running. When we talked before the summit, Tom, we talked about that example of President Trump's meeting with Kim Jong-un, where it was bonhomie and friendship, but then President Trump walked away. Is that what's happened here? One of the aspects of this that everyone is pointing out, and everybody is right to, is that we need to wait and see what we discover. Both sides, and by that I mean both the U.S., the Trump administration, and the Russians will be spinning, heavily spinning in the hours ahead. There are officials on both sides who want to make this look good, be positive, and they will be, the Russians certainly will be out there telling their own journalists and therefore the world what happened here. One other point, though, as a counterpoint really, is of course President Trump did not walk out and say, well, we haven't reached a deal, so therefore tariffs and sanctions. I'm going to impose that 50% sanction on tariff on India. I'm going to double down on support for Ukraine. He didn't say any of that. And just remember that I think just a week ago or so, President Trump had a deadline for President Putin where he said, if you don't agree to a ceasefire, I am going to really punish you. He didn't say that in that meeting, and it may be that in the days ahead, that will be assessed as a win for President Putin. That in a sense, coming to this meeting, having all of these images beamed around the world and walking away without any agreement but without any punishment, that will be assessed as a win. But we really do need to hear the details of what really happened, and neither of those leaders gave us that in that news conference.
Yeah, not even a little bit. All right, Keir, stand by for us. We've just learned that Sergei Lavrov was asked by reporters several questions as he walked by reporters. He didn't answer any of the questions. He just continued on his way. I want to bring in Garrett Haig here. Garrett, listen, President Trump 2.0, this new administration, the second time around, he's learned a lot. You can, whether you like the president or not, he's much more disciplined in a lot of ways. His team's a lot more disciplined. There may very well be a great deal on the table, and they're just staying tight-lipped about it to make sure they have all sides to agree, and they'll announce it at a later date. That's not President Trump's usual style, especially when you have a backdrop like this in the world watching. He wants to deliver for his audience, but that could be the case.
Look, obviously it's a very complex situation, but I will say it is very unusual that both Vladimir Putin's spoke first and for more than twice as long as President Trump did, having the first opportunity to categorize what happened in this meeting, that the president chose to take no questions, although he's expected to give at least one interview tonight, so we may hear from him. And then I'm not hearing, and our colleagues I'm in contact with aren't hearing anything from our sources within the administration offering even an early spin on what would make this meeting here today a success. What I'm seeing from some of the MAGA allies of the president, some of his biggest allies on the internet, are tweets about, comments about how Vladimir Putin affirmed that if Trump were president in 2022, this war wouldn't have started in the first place. Tom, that's not what this meeting was about.
No one's having that argument. Now, explain this to our viewers. When you're watching news conferences like this, you're on your phone, you're reaching out to different people in the administration, Republicans, people that are watching, and usually in these situations when things go well, your phone's blowing up with positivity. It's just quiet.
That's right. I mean, the president and his allies are very good at amplifying his message, and usually there's a pretty clear, it's usually pretty easy to tell what the message is that they want to be the key takeaway if they feel like something has been a success. That they are so quiet in this instance could be surprising given the overall sensitivity of this, but when you consider how many people were in the room, this 3-on-3 versus a 1-on-1, and the fact that so many officials were here preparing for such bigger meetings, this seems like a disappointment on its face. Again, I don't want to prejudge it, but there's no one out here claiming that this was a victory. There was a lot of hype about this being an historic meeting, and other than the pictures, which will live forever on this, it's not at all clear what was achieved, if anything.
Because we talk about the Russian delegation. You had finance ministers here. You had investment envoys here. You had defense ministers. I mean, the Russians brought their team to Alaska, and it's unclear why these meetings ended so early. They didn't address that in the news conference. Peter Alexander is still there. He was witnessing this up close, just steps away from that podium. Peter, have we gotten any more information on the two countries? We've been waiting to hear those jets roar and take off over our heads as either Vladimir Putin heads back to Russia or the president heads back to D.C. Do we know anything more about the schedule? And is this summit essentially over?
It's a good question. We have no indication that there are any additional meetings taking place here, though I haven't heard the roar of either engine. They were parked on tarmacs not far from us right now. Tom, I'm struck by a couple of things as the president prepares to leave here in Alaska. First, his desire, of course, that this would be an extended trip where Volodymyr Zelensky would be brought here, as he said, because that would be easiest to come up with a deal to end this war. But separately, I'm struck by what I think a lot of critics are going to note right now, which is, in effect, that the Russian President Vladimir Putin appears to have gotten most everything that he wanted from this visit here. He got a photo op with the President of the United States where the red carpet was rolled out. They shared the stage and handshakes and smiles. They also shared a ride in the Beast. Separately, there is no, at least as it appears at this time, ceasefire that was agreed to, which is to say that Vladimir Putin can continue his offensive taking place in Ukraine right now. And finally, perhaps most notably, he avoided sanctions, additional sanctions that were supposed to go into effect this time last week. You'll remember it was a week ago that was in effect the deadline day for more sanctions to be levied by the United States against Russia unless this war came to an end, unless they agreed to a ceasefire. Well, it doesn't appear that those new sanctions have gone into effect right now. And if nothing else, this extends that window for the Russians. So I think in many ways, a lot of critics of this visit in particular will view that as one way that Vladimir Putin won. Donald Trump will suggest that he had some success because he was able to make some progress. What that progress is remains unclear, but as Richard and our colleagues have indicated, perhaps for the Ukrainians in particular, they can rest assured that no deal was reached without them present, which allows in some form this to extend. The sad fact, though, is that that means the war in Ukraine also continues unabated.
Yeah.
Tom?
And all that killing. Peter, we thank you. Stand by for us. Speaking of Richard Engel, I want to go to him now. He's live in Ukraine for us. Richard, I know you've been sort of analyzing everything that we've been analyzing and try to glean anything from the statements that were made. One important thing President Trump did say that we should note, saying that they agreed on a lot of small things, but there was one big thing they couldn't agree on, that they weren't able to agree on one big thing. We don't know what that big thing is. It could have been the land swap. It could have been the territory that Russia has sort of conquered at this point, 20% of Ukraine. We don't know what that is. But you're from the school of thought from seeing this. You think that possibly there could be a real deal on the table, and President Trump is essentially waiting for approval from all sides?
Well, Vladimir Putin was certainly talking about a deal as if a deal has been done. And President Trump was saying that they've agreed on a lot of points, but not one, and that he's got to talk to NATO, he's got to talk to President Zelensky. He had just agreed to President Zelensky and European allies, including the Secretary General of NATO, that he would do exactly that he wouldn't go to Alaska, that he wouldn't sign his name on the dotted line, and he wouldn't make any rushed agreements. So it's possible that there is an agreement, as Vladimir Putin says there is, an agreement that Kyiv is not going to like and that the Europeans are not going to like, and that he's just got to deliver that news to President Zelensky and the Europeans. But that is still, that means that this process is still underway. It means that the President Zelensky gets a vote. That means that the Europeans can add their concerns. Nobody here in Ukraine wants this war to continue. Everybody here wants this war to stop. But what Ukrainians are concerned about is that if President Trump or Vladimir Putin today had announced a deal unilaterally, that it wouldn't stop the war, that it would just set up a bigger, more serious conflict in which more Ukrainians would lose their lives. So it's not that Ukrainians are anxious to keep this war going and that they want to keep sending their sons and daughters to the front lines every single day, but they thought a bad deal is worse than no deal. And it seems like there's still possibility to reach a better deal.
Richard, both sides are losing lives essentially almost every minute of the day in this war. You've covered so many wars and conflicts. How hard is it to get a ceasefire in place? And maybe the better question is, how quickly will it take for a ceasefire to really be active in this region? Because the president mentioned something about saving thousands of lives every day.
So this war, Tom, and I've covered a lot of wars, as you mentioned, this war is all about land. Wars in the Middle East are often about identity or about religion and history. There is some of that here as well, but this one is primarily about land. Vladimir Putin doesn't believe that Ukraine should exist as an independent country, and he wants their land. And 3.5 years ago, he invaded this country with the intention of taking all of Ukraine, toppling the government, getting rid of Zelensky, putting in a puppet, and taking control of Ukraine the way that Ukraine was dominated under the Soviet Union. It didn't work. The Ukrainians fought back, but the Russians are still on Ukrainian territory. They're still holding 20% of Ukrainian land. So reaching a ceasefire just means the fighting stops. But what about that 20%? What about the Ukrainian troops who are on the front line? Do they pull back? What about the thousands of Russian troops who are launching attacks every day on Ukrainians from Ukrainian soil? Do they get to stay? Do those battle lines become permanent? And those are all the questions that Ukrainians want to know. And those are the questions that Ukrainians say must be answered. Otherwise, there will never be anything like a lasting peace agreement, that you can have a ceasefire, but that you'll have more conflicts down the road unless you address those fundamental questions. So this is a hard one. Even if we get a ceasefire, and maybe we do get a ceasefire announcement in the next couple of days or next week, then the very difficult process begins of the territorial discussions. Do the Russians get to stay on the land that they have conquered, or do they have to leave? And Vladimir Putin has made it very, very clear that he has no intention of pulling back his troops.
Richard Engel, we thank you. Garrett Haake, while I have you for less than a minute here, President Trump will return back to Washington, D.C. He's going to be handling a lot, but this is not going to go away anytime soon.
No, it's not. And perhaps even before he takes off, Tom, we're going to have what will be the most scrutinized conference call, perhaps, in history of this conflict. The president said he would brief European leaders and President Zelensky on what exactly went down during this summit, which President Putin described as an agreement and one that he didn't want to see European leaders interfere with. What comes out of that call, I think, set up the next stages in this conflict and the discussions to end it.
All right, Garrett Haake first. Garrett, we thank you. That concludes this NBC News special report. We'll have much more coverage on our streaming network, NBC News Now, online at NBCNews.com. And I'll see many of you in just a minute for Nightly News. I'm Tom Yamas, live in Anchorage, Alaska. We thank you for watching tonight. We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.